everyone. I'm going to be talking about how to design a search platform. I mean, the questions that you should be asking when you start off with designing a search platform. But before that, a little bit about myself. I'm a Lucene Solar committer, been involved with the community long enough, and I've built search platforms at multiple organizations for both in-house teams and external customers. And most importantly, I spend most of my time working on open source stuff. So moving on, I'm going to take some benefit of being among the early talks for the conference, so I'm going to talk a little bit about solar. If you look at those numbers out there, all that comes from Open Hub. What those numbers actually tell you is that solar is a pretty active project. And not only that, it's got a pretty good safety security statistics out there. What that basically means is if you're trying to look at using search, it's a pretty good choice, obviously, to go with. So diving a little deep, this is how search engine generally looks like. More importantly, that's how solar looks like. And I'm sorry, I have 6 Zookeeper nodes there. It should be an odd number, but yeah. So you have a bunch of Zookeeper nodes forming an ensemble there. You have, for the sake of simplicity, just 2 solar nodes with a ton of replicas or cores or whatever you want to call them. And you have a bunch of clients trying to talk to them, trying to send requests for indexing or searching or doing whatever. That's the most simplified version of a diagram that would represent a solar setup, right? That brings us to the search platform. We saw how search in isolation looks like if you had to stand something up and send documents and have that data searchable. The previous diagram showed how things would look. So when you try to build a search platform, it generally ends up looking something like this. This is, again, a more simplified version of what you would end up building when you're building a search platform. So you have an admin interface that interacts with either the user or the manager of the cluster itself. You have a bunch of indexes that work in isolation, and those locks there basically are security layers for users to kind of stay in isolation. And then you have things like a monitoring interface. You might have other things that are satellite systems. Could be NLP stuff. Could be other APIs that you have that talk to or search talks to them to get more information, annotations for your data, whatever. So you end up building all of these smaller components, and you have in isolation all those indexes working there with indexing endpoints and search endpoints. So that brings us to the first question. Not really a question, because I'm assuming you have an answer for that already, which is why do you need a search platform, right? Search being not a really simple problem ends up being rather complicated or non-trivial, so to say. So for people who are trying to set this thing up, say within the organization or people outside of the organization, multiple customers trying to build the same thing over and over again, is the same effort that goes into setting up search for them, even though their use case might be fairly straightforward, simple, and trivial. The effort that goes into it is non-trivial. So there's that, and why you really need a platform is to make those tasks almost trivially repeatable. What that does in the end is it reduces the cost because you don't have to reinvest into the non-trivial part, non-trivial work that I've been talking about. So yeah, that's basically the intention of having a platform over having isolated instances of solar or search running for multiple customers or internal teams. So let's dive into more interesting questions about what you should be asking when you're trying to build such a system, such a platform. And let me warn you with one thing. I'm not going to come up with answers or solutions and tell you stuff that you should be always doing when you're trying to build a search platform. It's more like a very basic checklist of things that you should address when you're trying to build something like this. Having worked at multiple organizations that are trying to solve the same problem, I've seen a lot of questions going unanswered because the assumption is that those questions are pretty obvious, you don't really need to address those questions, or you never thought about those questions to begin with. So the first most important question is, who's the user, right? Obviously, it is the most important question. If you don't have the answer to that question, you have no idea which way to go, right? What features to build, how big your data would be, anything at all. So at the users certainly can be classified into different categories. To begin with, I would really classify them into two separate, really broad categories of being internal users and external users, depending upon who you're catering to. You could be building a search platform that caters to multiple teams within your organization. You could be building a system that exposes search as a service to customers outside of your company. So you build them in a very separate way. Why I would classify them into these two categories is because it's kind of a differentiator, right? So the internal users are more liberal. They're more willing to share resources. They're more willing to share their access logs, a bunch of other stuff. Whereas external users are generally strict and guarded. They don't really want to have, at times, platform owners have access to their own data, to their data. They don't certainly want any other customer to have any access to their data, to their logs, to their resources, anything of that sort, right? So you really need to answer this question as to who are you building the system for. You cannot at least attempt to build this for both the groups at the same time. Also, I'd like to mention that when I say internal, I don't explicitly say any team, any person who's trying to build a platform or any team that's trying to build a platform for internal users is totally different from external users, because you might have an organization where internal teams work in enough isolation for them to be categorized as pretty much external users. That brings us to the second question. Where in the pyramid is the user? The pyramid I'm talking about is basically this stack of how advanced the user is in terms of their capability or their desire to build the search or use the search or consume different features from search. Let's start off from the bottom of the pyramid, which is the most basic user. An example of that would be, say, you're building a platform for, say, for websites that just want to parse search on their content. They're not bothered about anything else. They just have a bunch of pages on HTML pages on their website. They just want to parse search on that. Could be things like banking websites that are helping customers find, say, the page that leads to opening of a savings bank account. So you just need very basic search there. They also want features like auto detection of fields, something that you shouldn't be implementing for anyone but them. Like, I'm not a fan of that. The second one is the intermediate and the most challenging layer. That lies right between the topmost layer, which is the advanced user, which we're going to talk about in a bit, and the basic layer. These are the bunch of users who are aware about search features, how does search work, about tokenization, about analyzers, about a bunch of other stuff. So they're advanced. They also tend to want a lot more, or they think they want a lot more than they actually do. And the topmost layer is the advanced user, where people really want custom plugins, custom code, dependencies, ton of other stuff, right? So they have a very different set of requirements. So when you're building your search platform, knowing your user, you need to basically build it for either the top or the bottom of the pyramid. You cannot be again approaching the entire pyramid to begin with, not at the start at least. And no matter what you do, you would end up spilling over and addressing or supporting people from the middle tier, because the middle tier is not, those lines that differentiate those tiers are not, they're not hard lines. They're just, that's a fuzzy differentiator between what's a top user or the advanced user, what's a basic user, and then everything in between ends up being intermediate. So anyone who knows anything about search is going to be an intermediate user. So no matter who you cater to, you will end up catering to the middle tier, always. Another question that's rather important is who's going to manage a cluster? And when I say clusters here, I'm not really talking about hardware and deployment of servers or network stuff, but I'm just talking about things like scalability, right? So being able to split a shard, being able to add a replica, being able to just very basic but important way of scaling or taking care of your cluster, so managing your cluster in that logical sense. And there I would kind of segregate, I would want you to segregate your users between two broad categories again, which is self-servicing or the delegated ones. Self-servicing being you give them a bunch of things, a bunch of APIs or a bunch of endpoints which they could use to do things like adding a replica or split a shard or scaling up or down, whatever they wanted to do based on what they see or what they expect their traffic or data to look like. The delegated ones, on the other hand, are basically users that want magic, right? So they're not aware of search a lot. They don't understand the idea of splitting a shard. How does that work? When shouldn't they do it? When should they do it? And so you basically need to, again, categorize your users between, are you going to give them self-servicing tools, or are you going to let them delegate everything to you and own up everything? What ends up happening, or what's the sweet spot here again, is that a combination of the two. So you give them things to do, things that they can use, or endpoints that they can use, or APIs that they can use to scale up or scale down, do things like that are required to manage your cluster. One thing that I'd like to kind of really highlight here is you should remember that all your users always are hostile to you. Like, you as the platform owner are always in a spot where your users are ready to take you down. That's not deliberate, that's not intentional. It's just that they're not bothered about your platform. All they're bothered about is having their stuff work, their documents indexed. And if they receive 1 million documents a second, they're going to push all of them to you. If they receive a surge in traffic, they're going to push everything to you. You're the one who's got to be guarding everything. So if someone goes out and says, oh, I'm anticipating a lot of traffic and spins up 100 replicas for a single shard, it's up to you to make sure that this one user doesn't end up hogging all the resources that were meant for the entire platform for hundreds of other customers who are using the same platform. So when you give people tools and try to be in that safe spot, think about what you're going to expose, how you're going to limit them, how you're going to stop them from taking your system down, because that's really important. Now, having your platform is good, but one thing that people generally tend to overlook is how would the end users interact with your platform, right? So you have a platform, you know who's going to manage it, you know how the user looks like, you know what features to offer, stuff like that. But an important question there is how is the end user going to interact with your system, right? So repeat to yourself, customer APIs cannot change, right? It's very easy as a developer or the owner of a platform to go out and say, I'm going to deprecate an API or an endpoint, and I'm going to change everything to look like this really nice, cool thing that I think is the right way of doing things. Well, nice and good, but users are probably using your APIs or your clients or whatever you offer to them to begin with at enough places that it's a hard problem to change all of that. And so you need to spend a lot of thought in designing two things, most importantly, the endpoint itself and the APIs. Both basically together form the entire umbrella of how would the client or how the customer interact with your platform, right? So think about the endpoint. What would the endpoint look like? Would it ever change? Would they need to take care of it? How would they discover it? Things like that. Also, in terms of the APIs, think about the client. Are you going to offer a REST endpoint? How would it look like? How would it be compatible? So that's the important part. You need to think about compatibility in terms of what you intend to expose in the future. Not at that point in time, not when you're beginning or starting off with your platform, but in the future. When you expose tens of other features, they need to work and look like they belong to the same system instead of being these segregated, very different looking APIs. So what's generally needed, right, from the interaction perspective? You need restriction of requests at times. So people want to send in requests, and you, either for traffic reasons or for other reasons, do not want those requests to go through. It's good to take care of that at the client level. Abstraction of Zookeeper. Now, that's something that Solar Cloud exposes, which is for you to use Cloud Solar Client, which is a recommended way to talk to Solar when you're using Solar Cloud. you need to be aware of the Zookeeper connection string, and that exposes a bunch of stuff, especially when you're running a platform where your Zookeeper is used by multiple users. You don't want to expose that part. Not only that, you really don't want them to know about things like Zookeeper, because the entire idea of building a platform was to make things trivial, make things easy, to get them to remember fewer things, fewer moving parts, and for them to just have a simple way of talking to a system and doing exactly what they need to do without knowing what lies underneath and how this thing works. You need to have throttling at times, so you need to have pushback and other stuff to, again, keep your system up and running and healthy, even when they're trying to take you down, not deliberately, again, hopefully. And fail fast for non-supported features. As I said, you're not going to expose all features that Solar comes out of the box with. You're probably going to shield or restrict a bunch of things, and so there would be non-supported, unsupported features. And when that's the situation, you need to find a way to kind of fail at the client level. And you need stable APIs, most importantly. So with all of these things in mind, why would you want to use Solar Client, like out of the box or extend it? Well, one good thing is you piggyback on Solar APIs, and then you don't need to document a bunch of stuff. But the documentation of Solar clients is not as good as it should be, but the Java docs at least are good enough. But in addition to that, you might need things like filtering, and you might have your own custom features that you've exposed, which Solar clients don't come with. Now you can extend your Solar client to incorporate or support all those features, but you're going to miss out on other things and not be able to restrict calls that are exposed to the Solar client. So here's why not you wouldn't want to use Solar client or extend Solar client. So as I said, right, so custom Solar client to Solar client is exactly what Search platform is to vanilla Solar, which is you want to take away the complexity and make it really trivial for users to use. And having your own client that's rather simpler doesn't require users to understand things and exactly understand how Solar works. And that's not just in terms of the APIs themselves and what works, what doesn't work, and things like Zookeeper, but there's also a bunch of things within the client, which is like things like you can do the same thing. So Solar client gives you the power to do the exact thing in 5 different ways, and you don't really want to expose that to the user because it's easy for a new user to be confused when they try to look at Solar clients. You want to restrict features, as I just mentioned, and there are a bunch of experimental APIs. Also, Solar clients change really fast. And when I say change, it's not addition of new features, it's just change the APIs. Also because a ton of them are marked as experimental. The ones that are not, they still have a tendency of changing drastically between major versions, but getting deprecated way more frequently than your users would like. So there's a lot of flux, and you don't really want your customers or your users to kind of take care of all of that flux. And one more thing, in case you already are using that and you know about the challenges of using Solar clients, it does return named lists as a response. If you don't know about it, please don't learn about it. That's okay. But if you do know about named lists, it's not something desirable that the end user would really like or appreciate to receive as a response. So that brings us to the question about what's the plan to scale, right? Obviously, start small and then go from there because that's how it's supposed to be done, not just with Surge, but pretty much with everything. And scalability, again, people tend to address 2 questions when they're building a search platform, which is, oh, we need to scale, and we're gonna be supporting X amount of data by the end of 3 months. We're gonna be supporting Y amount of data by the end of 6 months, and so far and so forth. And also, in terms of traffic, they have some idea about how much they can support to begin with and how much they can grow. What they're missing there most of the times is they have a parallel track of developers working on a bunch of features. And as soon as you put these features on top of your current platform, it changes the way things look. It changes the way that your platform consumes resources. And when that happens, your entire assumption about being able to support X amount of data, which was based on the idea or concept of complexity of the system not changing at all, is now out of the window, right? I mean, it's no longer the case. And now probably you've added a feature that uses tons of resources that doesn't even allow you to support the amount of data that you currently do. Forget about expanding that to being able to support twice as much data. So think about that. So start with supporting limited amount of data, throttling back on responses, but think about the features. Think about what features you're going to add. Think about how those features impact your data and your traffic, and then take it from there. Do not forget about the features that you're planning to add over the course of time, because that's an easy thing to get missed. I've seen that happen way often than you'd like. So how are you going to monitor? You have a system that's up and running, but then at the end of it, if it's not really working, if there are things going down, somebody needs to monitor, bring things back up. X-ray vision maybe, but as one of my slides said, there's the entire idea of delegation versus self-servicing, and that ties back into this thing, which is the user needs to know when to kind of do things even to scale. At the same time, the user also needs to know when things are going wrong if they're responsible to take care of it. Now, that basically means you need to expose a bunch of stuff, but because you're the platform owner and they're more than willing to bring your system down, you should make sure that you're not exposing everything to them. You should only expose the stuff that is required for them to do the stuff that they really need to do. For everything else, it should just be managed by the users, by the platform owner, which should be you. And monitor the metrics as much as possible. That's also one thing that people tend to miss out on, which is when they're building a search platform, they don't think about a lot of metrics that they might need in the future. But once the system is up and running, deployed for multiple users, something goes wrong, and they go back and look at it, unable to correlate anything that they have in their metrics or their logs, only to realize that there's one thing that they should have logged which they didn't, and now it's hard to figure out. And what that requires is a code change to maybe log another metric or push it somewhere. But it also involves a redeployment of the entire cluster, right, or the entire platform, which is painful. So think about what you need, think about everything that you might need, and start pushing it into a system, right? So Solar has metric reporters, so think about using those metric reporters rather than just kind of reinventing the wheel, because that generally wouldn't work. Also check with the community. There might be someone who's working on something very similar in terms of the reporter that you might need. And if there's a reporter for a system that you think people use, way more often at more places and is publicly available, then it might be a good idea to probably create a JIRA and contribute a reporter for that system. So how do you manage versioning and upgrades? We've spoken about monitoring and management and cluster, exposing things to the end user. But that's one of the most challenging things that comes up once you have your system up and running and you realize, oh, we've added a bunch of new features, or there have been bug fixes, we need to now upgrade. Well, very nice thing to do, but one thing to remember, it's hard to not be on more than one version. It's easy to say that I'm always going to stick with one version for the entire platform. It's super hard. And the reason for that is there might be users who are using your older version and are not willing or do not have the bandwidth to upgrade or make client changes or even drop in a jar that you used to, even if you vetted the jar and you're asking them to drop in and replace the jar, they're probably unable to do so due to lack of bandwidth or just being unwilling to do so. So remember that you need to fix this. You need to handle it yourself. And a really good way to do that is by having a proxy in the middle. What that does is that would kind of isolate your customer interaction or your user interaction with your main platform. A lot of people don't end up adding a proxy, exposing Solar directly just because it's easy to do so and build such a platform. But having a proxy is an amazing thing, especially because you can go ahead and isolate not just support for multiple versions, because you're going to have your own client that's going to be talking to the Solar proxy, and you don't need to really change that. All you need to change is, say, if you want to upgrade your Solar version, you can bump up the version for everyone and have the client that's used by the proxy to talk to your Solar instances be upgraded. So the end user doesn't need to basically upgrade anything, and that's a pretty good place to be in. Not only that, if things don't go as planned, you have the ability to roll things back without going back to your end users and saying, you know what, we asked you to upgrade something, and that didn't work out as well. Can you roll this back? That's almost impossible to ask for from end users. And yeah, note that you should not need to roll back often, but yeah, things happen. So what are your plans about cluster security for you and your users? And safety is almost everything, almost always. A lot of people tend to believe in that. That could mean a lot of things, right? Security could be basic authentication, authorization, needing to use things like Kerberos, to wanting SSL and on-disk encryption. You might even need things like document level or field level obfuscation, right? In terms or access control. So you might be an insurance company where there are agents who have access to insurance data of users, but you do not want them to have access to certain fields, like social security numbers or something else. So your search system should be, if that is your use case, if that is what you're trying to cater to, you need to think about everything that is required to, fit into the compliance side of things, but also in terms of just basic sanity for such users. You want to be sure that you have things like document field level restrictions. Now, one important thing is to ask this question about how much security do you really need? Take that answer, add a few more things that you think you don't need, not randomly, but think about it a little more, and take that to be your baseline for how much security you will need, because it's easy to go in and say, we're just going to have a system that's up and running. We don't really care about security, only to realize that nobody is willing to use it because security is so important to almost all your users. So think about those things. They could be deal breakers for most of your users. And if that's the situation, you don't want to be in a position where you have a product that's now completed, but because of security, you can't have users. I think I missed something. Sorry. Did I slip a slide? Yeah, one more thing. So Solar manages the intra-cluster or inter-node communication. So you generally wouldn't need to do anything about that unless you're using some funky different security framework or security mechanism. And Solar makes it super easy for you to extend the existing security framework, for you to kind of use different third-party authentication authorization platforms. So if the rest of your platform relies on something that's not standard or supported out of the box, but is something that's publicly available, think about extending that part in Solar, adding that as a plugin, and maybe contributing back so that other users who are using the same security mechanism can piggyback and use the same stuff. That brings us to how sensitive is your data, right? And if you read a blog post in journals these days, most tech journals every now and then would cover things about, I'm not going to share my data with so-and-so organization or device or whatever, because I don't think it's safe enough. Or there's that sensitivity question about what I'm willing to put on or share on a system versus what I'm not. So you need to address that question in terms of what can you really do with the data, right? So can you even log the requests? There are use cases, again, things like insurance or things that have SPI data, so sensitive private information, where you are not allowed to log anything. The documents that are coming in to queries that are being received, you can't log anything. So if that is the data that you're catering to, if you're building a platform for such customers, you need to make sure that you put in one thing, which is you add in some mechanism for you to track every request that goes in so that you have some idea about what's going on in the system when someone comes back and says, oh, we have a lot of errors, or we have a lot of errors with the request. We can't share the requests, but can you take a look? You can at least go back and say, we see X number of errors. We see these are the IDs. And go back to your customer. So give these IDs back to your customer as part of your response. You can do that in multiple places, but just make sure that you're sending that ID back to the customer so that there's some means of communication between the customer and you. The customer, the person who knows what the query looks like, and you who knows what was the query that went bad or had issues or was probably trying to bring down the system. So if you see a lot of queries that are hitting hard on the system, you might want to go back to your customer saying, did you change something? Here's a query ID that I have, which is probably bringing down the system. So you should have something, and that could come in terms of some form of a request ID or something. So make sure you add that if your data is sensitive. Also, think about things like, do you have access to data for doing a bunch of stuff? Can you store it? When you retrieve it, how does it go back? So think about all of those sensitive data sensitivity questions when you're building a system for such users. And now for the more advanced use cases, people who have custom plugins. So customers who want custom plugins, trying to pull off that magic trick out of the hat. So, well, when you have a bunch of such users, all of them tend to believe that their custom plugins are magic. They're essential to what they're doing, and this stuff cannot be done outside of Solar. It could be analyzers, rankers, it could be anything. It could actually just be doing magic. One thing is, if you bring in such things, such pieces of code into your system, it's hard to maintain, especially if you're not the owner. If you're not the creator or manager or the person who's supposed to take care of these plugins or writes these plugins, it's super hard to manage them. And that basically means you shouldn't even have them in your system unless there is no other way out. And if that is the situation, think about the other question, which is this a standard plugin? Are there more teams that might want to use this? Are there more customers that might want a more generic plugin that solves the same purpose? And if that's the answer, then start working on such a plugin. Because if you have a lot of users who are trying to solve the same problem with 10 different plugins doing exactly the same thing, it's going to be a nightmare to maintain. Every time I spoke about being able to transparently upgrade your Solar version. That wouldn't be the case anymore as soon as you bring in custom plugins into the fold. So think about owning a plugin, creating a plugin, having a standardized plugin, or ask them to do it outside. If they cannot do this inside, then just ask them to do this outside of Solar. Unless it's an advanced platform only used by internal teams who are very happy to expose everything to each other. So if that's so a typical case would be where the team that owns the platform is basically the bunch of people who are using it. So if they combine together to form a search platform, which would be a hard thing to do, to just work with each other. But if that's the situation, then you might get around with just using something like the blob store, which is Solar's way of being able to distribute Solar plugins through an API call. So you don't need to go ahead and manually place these plugins at all places. You can just upload them and then register them. So just API calls. Well, all of this is nice and good, but what if you lose your data? None of this would make any sense. I mean, yes, I have monitoring that says I have no replicas for a given shard because I lost everything. That wouldn't be nice. So things don't go always as planned. So you generally want to go ahead and make sure you have some way of backing things up. And to do that, you need to answer a few questions again, which is, how often do you want to back up? Where do you want to back up? How long do you want to keep these backups? And it probably would also tie into a bit with the security and the privacy part, which is, can you even get a backup? Is it even allowed for you to get a backup? Is the data obfuscated or not? If it's not obfuscated and you can't hold that data, you can't back it up. So you probably want encrypted data to begin with so that you could back it. And think about cleaning things up. Make sure you don't clean up stuff that could be used. I've seen that happen, where everything was accidentally deleted. So we lost all backups just because we were trying to be more aggressive in terms of cleaning things up. The backups did not happen. The cleanup script ran and cleaned up everything. So do you want to support auto reindex? A lot of people like it. A lot of people want it. Also because it comes from a lot of people who initially play around with Elasticsearch, I think, and it's like, oh, this is a cool thing, having an endpoint that reindexes everything. Well, nice thing to have, but if your data is sensitive, again, you can't do this. If your data, also think about how often do you need this? If there's one customer who will ever need this once in a year, you probably don't want to build and invest into such a system, unless that customer is like the most important customer for you, and you're basically building the system for them. So think about that, and make sure that if you are relying on stuff like this, then you probably want to also use aliases instead of exposing collection names directly, because that helps the user in a really nice way, which is they don't need to change their client code and rename their collection names all over their client code, and can just swap out the aliases with a new collection that they create or are restored into. So that's a good thing to do, and Proxy would be a nice place to manage all of the aliasing and removal, deletion of aliases, creation, backing up stuff. So yeah, again, Proxy comes in handy when you're trying to do a bunch of stuff. None of this would be useful unless people knew how to use your system, right? So how are you going to train your system? Send them to a library, maybe? Not really, right? But it's an often overlooked question. People don't address this question. So it's easy when you're starting off with something. You go ahead and say, OK, I'm going to have this this platform up and running, and the initial customers that I bring in, I'm going to handhold each one of them. But what you're forgetting is, if you're not building a system that's easy to use, requires handholding, it's going to be a nightmare to scale. So think about making things really easy to use, to onboard, to begin with, because it's going to be really hard to change things going forward. And not just, so come up with demos, examples, but it doesn't end there. Not just the onboarding part, it also goes on to best practices, code examples, API usages, how to do certain things. And maybe create like an internal user list for your customers to talk to each other or send in requests about what their questions are, so that you don't end up receiving the same request from 20 different customers when it could have been just solved with one reply. One more thing. Do you plan to fork? I've seen that happen so often that it's not even funny. It's scary. And what ends up happening is people fork. It doesn't take a lot of time before they're way off. And going back is a nightmare. Like, they don't have any idea about what they've added. They have no idea about how much they've strayed. And I've seen situations where they've actually forked to, say, make logging less verbose. It's like, oh, Solar logs a bunch of stuff. We have a lot of cores. And so we want less logging because it ends up using a lot of disk. It's like, OK, and what did you do? It's like, we forked. We commented out all the code. It's like, OK, and it's like over 350 different commits, we commented out different pieces of code or logs. It's like, yeah, and now you're 350 commits apart. And it's a nightmare, cherry picking stuff or doing anything. So please do not fork. If there are things that you really, really want to do in Solar that Solar is not capable of or doesn't let you extend, it's a good idea always to come up with a JIRA, discuss that in the community, saying this is what I'm trying to do. Solar does not allow me to extend this. How can I do this in a manner that it's not a nightmare for me when I upgrade Solar versions or move to, move between things. So talk about it in the community and build that as a separate plugin that can be dropped into a more recent version at will, rather than cherry picking stuff. Yeah, please don't fork. It's a nightmare. And yeah, as I say, if you do, please read the offer document carefully before investing. It's hard. It can get more than tricky. So summary, as I said, when I started off, I'm not going to come up with answers. I'm not going to come up with, oh, wow, kind of things, but I'm going to walk you through a bunch of things that people tend to forget when they're starting off and building something like a search platform. And it's easy to forget because it's overwhelming. It's huge. It's a giant task. And it's easy to also get straight and concentrate on things that are not even important. So think about these things. list them down and address them. You can put them on the back burner, but at least address them. So keep it simple, cater to a few use cases, remember the pyramid, to not try to cover the entire pyramid. Don't bite off more than you can chew. Yeah, think about how many people you are and what you're trying to accomplish over how long of a duration, and then act accordingly. It's easy to go ahead and want to build a magical platform that does a ton of amazing stuff, but maybe it's going to take way more time than you anticipate. And yeah, last but not the least, start with the most recent stable release. And please don't try to keep up with releases. We're pretty aggressive with releases. Like there was a time we were having multiple parallel releases, monthly releases. So stick to a release unless you need something that is only available in a more frequent release. It's kind of easy to get tempted into, oh, there's a new release, we should probably use it. It's like if you don't really need it, don't put in that effort, not at that time. But don't fall back by a lot. It's going to be hard to upgrade from like 2 versions up. Don't do that. Try to keep up with the latest major version, but don't try to move within the minor versions, especially if you don't need something that's been released. And that's it from me, and I think I just got it right in time. Thank you so much, and those are the ways you can get in touch with me. Thank you.